The gunshots echoed through the canyon like thunder, sending birds scattering from the twisted juniper trees dotting the rugged landscape. Wilhelmina Parker clutched her infant daughter tighter to her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she urged her exhausted mare forward. Blood stained the sleeve of her tattered dress, not her own, but a grim reminder of what she'd left behind in Silver Creek. "Come on, Penny," she whispered to the horse, the animal's flanks heaving with exertion. "Just a little farther, girl." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail as Wilhelmina glanced over her shoulder for the 100th time. No riders visible yet, but they would come. Frank Calloway's men wouldn't stop until they found her, and the child they believed belonged to their boss. Her baby girl whimpered, tiny face scrunching against the jostling ride. At just 3 months old, little Sarah had already endured more hardship than most adults. Wilhelmina's milk had started drying up days ago from stress and poor nutrition, and the small supply of formula she'd managed to take was nearly gone. "SHH, sweetheart," Wilhelmina soothed, though her own voice quavered with fear. "We'll find somewhere safe soon." The horse stumbled suddenly, nearly sending them both tumbling to the ground. Wilhelmina managed to stay mounted, but Penny's labored breathing told her the animal couldn't continue much longer. The nearest town was still half a day's ride, and night was approaching quickly. October in the Arizona Territory brought bitter cold after sundown, especially at this elevation. Desperate, Wilhelmina scanned the horizon. A thin wisp of smoke rose in the distance perhaps a mile away, curling up from behind a stand of ponderosa pines. A homestead, maybe, or a traveler's camp. Either meant people, and people could mean danger. But with temperatures dropping and her supplies depleted, she had no choice. She guided Penny toward the smoke, each step of the horse's hooves feeling like it might be the last. As they crested a small rise, Wilhelmina saw a modest cabin nestled against the base of a rocky cliff, a corral with several horses to one side, and a small barn behind. The property was well maintained, with split-rail fencing and what looked like a vegetable garden off to one side. A man emerged from the barn carrying a bucket, tall and broad-shouldered in a worn leather vest. The sight of him caused Wilhelmina to rein in sharply. A stranger meant unknown intentions, and in her experience, men's intentions were rarely good. As if sensing her presence, the man looked up, shading his eyes against the setting sun. He set down his bucket and started walking toward her, his gait unhurried but purposeful. Wilhelmina's heart hammered in her chest. She could turn and flee, but Penny clearly couldn't go much further. The baby began to cry in earnest now, her tiny wails carrying in the still evening air. "Madam," the man called out, stopping a respectful distance away. "You all right up there?" His voice was deep but gentle, with no trace of the menace she'd grown accustomed to hearing from men. Still, Wilhelmina hesitated, one hand instinctively moving to the small Derringer pistol hidden in the folds of her skirt. "My horse," she finally replied, her voice cracking from thirst. "She's about done in." The man nodded, approaching slowly with his hands visible at his sides. As he drew closer, Wilhelmina could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. A thick mustache adorned his upper lip, and his dark hair was in need of a trim. "Your mare looks like she's had a hard go of it," he said, reaching for Penny's bridle with careful movements. "And so do you, if you don't mind my saying." The baby's cries grew louder, and Wilhelmina saw the man's eyes flicker to the bundle in her arms, then to the blood on her sleeve. His expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes softened. "Name's Xavier Thornton," he said. "This is my place." Wilhelmina swallowed hard. "We don't mean to intrude." "If we could just rest a spell." Water the horse, a distant sound caught her attention, hoofbeats, faint but growing louder. Terror seized her heart as she twisted in the saddle to look back the way she'd come. Xavier Thornton heard it too. His gaze followed hers, then returned to her face, taking in her fear with a quick assessment. "Trouble following you?" he asked quietly. Wilhelmina nodded, too exhausted and frightened for pretense. "Bad trouble." Without another word, Xavier took Penny's reins and led the horse quickly toward the barn. "Keep low," he instructed. Inside, quick as you can." Once inside the barn, he helped her dismount, steady hands supporting her when her legs nearly buckled beneath her. The baby continued to cry, and Wilhelmina tried unsuccessfully to soothe her. "How many riders?" Xavier asked, peering through a crack in the barn door. "3, maybe 4, she answered. They're dangerous men." Xavier nodded, his expression grim but determined. "Wait here." He disappeared into a small tack room, returning moments later with a Winchester rifle. "Stay with your horse," he instructed. "If things go sideways, there's a root cellar under the main cabin, trapdoors under the bearskin rug." Before Wilhelmina could respond, Xavier was gone, slipping out a side door of the barn. Through the slats in the wooden walls, she watched him walk casually toward the front of his property, rifle held loosely at his side as if he'd just been out hunting. The riders appeared at the top of the ridge, 3 men, heavily armed, their horses lathered from hard riding. Wilhelmina pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the barn, her heart pounding so loudly she feared they might hear it. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Xavier's voice carried clearly in the still air. "Something I can help you with?" "Looking for a woman," one of the men replied, "riding a sorrel mare with a white blaze, traveling with an infant. What business you have with her?" Xavier asked, his tone conversational but with an edge of steel beneath. "That's between her and our employer," the man answered. "You seen her or not, mister?" There was a long pause, and Wilhelmina held her breath, clutching Sarah tighter to her chest. "Saw tracks heading west toward Copper Springs about an hour ago," Xavier finally said. "Looked like a horse carrying double, moving pretty fast considering." The men conferred among themselves, their voices too low for Wilhelmina to hear. Finally, the leader spoke again. "You sure about that, Cowboy? Because my boss, Mr. Calloway, he don't take kindly to folks who mislead us." "Don't much care what your boss takes kindly to," Xavier replied evenly. "This is my land you're on. I've answered your question, now I'll thank you to move along before it gets dark." Trail to Copper Springs gets tricky after sundown. The tension in the air was palpable. Wilhelmina could see Xavier's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on his rifle, though he kept it pointed at the ground. After what seemed an eternity, the leader spat on the ground. "Let's ride, boys." She can't have gotten far with that brat slowing her down. The men wheeled their horses around and galloped off in the direction Xavier had indicated. He stood watching until they disappeared from view, then quickly made his way back to the barn. "They're gone for now," he said, entering the dim interior where Wilhelmina waited. "But they might circle back once they realize I sent them on a wild goose chase." Wilhelmina stepped forward, the baby finally quieting against her shoulder. "Why did you help us? You don't know me." "You don't know what I've done." Xavier's eyes met hers steadily. "Don't need to. Anyone running that scared with a baby deserves at least the benefit of the doubt." He glanced at her blood-stained sleeve. "You hurt?" She shook her head. "It's not my blood." If this information troubled him, Xavier didn't show it. Instead, he gently took Penny's reins. "Your mare needs rest and care, and I reckon you and the little one could use the same." He led them out of the barn and across the yard to the cabin. The structure was larger than it had appeared from a distance, solidly built of pine logs with a stone chimney from which the smoke she'd spotted still curled. A covered porch wrapped around 2 sides, furnished with a rocking chair and a bench. Xavier opened the door and stepped aside, allowing Wilhelmina to enter first. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, clean, and well-organized, with a stone fireplace, sturdy wooden furniture, and shelves lined with books. A pot bubbled on the cast-iron stove, filling the room with the savory scent of stew. Wilhelmina stood uncertainly just inside the door, suddenly aware of how filthy and bedraggled she must look. The baby began to fuss again, making little hungry sounds that tore at her heart. "You and that baby are safe here," the cowboy said as he led her inside his home. "At least for tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out your next move." Tears welled in Wilhelmina's eyes at his simple kindness, something she'd experienced precious little of in recent years. "I don't know how to thank you." Xavier shook his head, looking almost embarrassed. "No need for thanks. Anyone would do the same." But they wouldn't, Wilhelmina knew. Most wouldn't risk their lives for a stranger, especially one who brought danger to their doorstep. I'm Wilhelmina, she said quietly. Wilhelmina Parker, and this is Sarah. Xavier nodded, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Pleased to meet you both, though I wish it were under better circumstances. He moved to the stove and lifted the lid on the pot. Stew's almost ready. You look like you could use a hot meal. The baby needs feeding first, Wilhelmina said, her voice tight with worry. I've only got a little formula left and my milk. She trailed off, embarrassed. Xavier didn't seem uncomfortable with the subject. My sister left some things here after her last visit with my nephew. Might be some condensed milk I can mix up for the little one. Not as good as mother's milk or proper formula, but it'll do in a pinch. He rummaged in a cabinet and produced a tin of condensed milk and a small glass bottle with a rubber nipple. My sister swears by this when she can't nurse. Let me heat some water. Wilhelmina watched in astonishment as this rugged cowboy efficiently prepared a bottle for her child, testing the temperature on his wrist just as she would have done. My sister had 4 young'uns, he explained, catching her surprised look. I helped with all of them. He handed her the bottle, and Wilhelmina gratefully fed Sarah, who sucked eagerly at the makeshift formula. The relief of seeing her daughter eat properly for the first time in days was overwhelming. There's a wash basin through that door, Xavier said, gesturing to a small adjoining room. Water's not hot, but it's clean. You can freshen up while I see to your horse. When he'd gone, Wilhelmina carried Sarah to the indicated room and found a simple but clean washing area. She cleaned herself and the baby as best she could with one arm, reluctant to set Sarah down even for a moment. The cold water stung her chapped hands but felt wonderful on her face and neck. A small mirror hung on the wall, and Wilhelmina barely recognized the woman who stared back at her gaunt cheeks, dark circles beneath her eyes, and her once lustrous auburn hair now dull and tangled. 2 weeks on the run had taken their toll. By the time Xavier returned, Wilhelmina had settled in a chair near the fire, Sarah sleeping peacefully in her arms. The warmth of the cabin and the feeling of relative safety had made her drowsy as well. Your mare's been fed, watered, and rubbed down, Xavier reported, washing his hands at the basin by the door. She's done in, but she'll recover with rest. He glanced at the sleeping infant. Looks like the little one's settled. Thank you, Wilhelmina said softly, for everything. Xavier nodded, then moved to the stove and ladled stew into a bowl. Eat, he said, placing it before her along with a chunk of crusty bread. I'll hold the baby if you like. Wilhelmina hesitated. She hadn't let Sarah out of her arms since they'd fled Silver Creek. But her stomach growled loudly at the smell of the food, and her arms ached with exhaustion. Cautiously, she allowed Xavier to take the sleeping infant. His large hands were surprisingly gentle as he cradled Sarah against his broad chest, and the baby didn't even stir during the transfer. The stew was simple venison, potatoes, and wild onions, but to Wilhelmina, it was the finest meal she'd ever tasted. She ate ravenously, only stopping when the bowl was empty. There's more, Xavier said, still holding Sarah with practiced ease. Wilhelmina shook her head. I couldn't. But thank you. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional soft sigh from the sleeping baby. Finally, Xavier spoke. Those men, he began carefully. They work for Frank Calloway, Wilhelmina tensed. You know him. Know of him, Xavier replied. Mining magnate, owns half the businesses in Silver Creek, has a reputation for getting what he wants one way or another. He wants my daughter, Wilhelmina said, her voice barely above a whisper. He believes she's his. Xavier's expression remained neutral. Is she? No, Wilhelmina's voice strengthened with conviction. Sarah is my husband's child, was my husband's child. She couldn't bring herself to say more, but Xavier seemed to understand what remained unspoken. Your husband, he said quietly. He's gone. Wilhelmina nodded, blinking back tears. Thomas was a geologist, worked for Calloway's mining company, when he discovered Calloway was falsifying reports to investors. She trailed off, the memory still too painful to articulate fully. An accident. Xavier asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. That's what they called it, Wilhelmina replied bitterly. A cave-in. Only Thomas wasn't supposed to be in that section of the mine that day. Xavier's jaw tightened beneath his mustache, and Calloway. Started calling at the house after the funeral. Bringing gifts, offering protection, said a widow like me needed looking after. Wilhelmina's voice grew cold. When I refused him, he became insistent, claimed Thomas had left debts, said I belonged to him now. Sarah stirred in Xavier's arms, and he automatically began a gentle rocking motion that quickly settled her. After Sarah was born, he became obsessed with her, kept saying she had his eyes, his chin. Wilhelmina's hands clenched in her lap. He tried to take her from me 2 weeks ago. His men came to the house in the night. There was a struggle. His foreman, Jenkins, her voice faltered. The blood on your sleeve, Xavier guessed. Wilhelmina nodded. I had Thomas's daring her. I never thought I could, but when Jenkins grabbed Sarah, she took a shuddering breath. I took his horse and fled, been running ever since. Xavier was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the sleeping child in his arms. You did what any mother would do, he finally said, protecting your young. His simple absolution loosened something tight in Wilhelmina's chest. She'd been carrying not just the weight of fear, but also guilt over taking a man's life, even a man like Jenkins. Calloway won't stop, she said. He has money influence. He'll tell people I kidnapped his child, that I'm mad with grief over Thomas's death. And you're heading where? Xavier asked. California, Wilhelmina replied. My cousin lives in San Francisco. Thomas sent her letters about his concerns before he died. She's the only one who might believe me. Xavier nodded thoughtfully. It's a long journey, especially with a young one. We don't have a choice, Wilhelmina said, fatigue evident in every line of her body. Xavier seemed about to say something else, but a sound outside the cabin made them both freeze. He carefully handed Sarah back to Wilhelmina and moved silently to the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. One rider, he reported quietly. Coming slow, not one of the men from before. He retrieved his Winchester from beside the door and stepped onto the porch. Wilhelmina could hear the murmur of voices, then Xavier returned, followed by an older man with a silver-streaked beard and a star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Miller, Xavier said by way of introduction. From Juniper Crossing, this is Mrs. Parker. The sheriff nodded politely to Wilhelmina, though his eyes were shrewd and assessing. Madam, Sheriff Miller brings news, Xavier continued. Seems Calloway's men have been asking questions all over the territory. They're saying you murdered Calloway's foreman and stole his child, madam, the sheriff said bluntly. There's a $500 reward for your capture. Wilhelmina felt the blood drain from her face. It's not true, she said, though she knew how feeble her denial must sound. Sarah is my daughter, my husband's daughter. The sheriff's weathered face revealed nothing. 3 armed men rode into Juniper Crossing this afternoon, showing a handbill with your description, said you were disturbed in the head after your husband's passing. And you rode out here because? Xavier asked, his hand still resting near his rifle. Because I knew Thomas Parker, the sheriff replied, surprising them both. Honest man, came into town a few months back, asked me to witness some documents. He reached into his vest and withdrew a folded paper. Made me promise to deliver this to his wife if anything happened to him. With trembling hands, Wilhelmina accepted the paper. It was a letter in Thomas's neat handwriting addressed to her. Thomas never mentioned. She began. Said he didn't want to worry you in your condition, Sheriff Miller explained. Being with child and all. Wilhelmina unfolded the letter and read quickly, her eyes widening. It's all here, she whispered. His evidence against Calloway, the falsified reports, the bribes to safety inspectors. She looked up at the sheriff. You knew, Miller shook his head. Only that Parker was concerned about some practices at the mine. He sealed the letter, asked me to keep it safe. He looked uncomfortable. When I heard about the accident, I should have come to you right away, madam. That's on me. You're here now, Xavier said. Question is, whose side are you on, Sheriff? Miller's eyes hardened. I uphold the law, Thornton, and from what I can see, Frank Calloway's been breaking it 6 ways to Sunday. He turned to Wilhelmina. That letter won't be enough to bring him down, madam. But it's a start. What are you suggesting? Xavier asked. That Mrs. Parker might want to take that evidence to the federal marshal in Prescott, Miller replied. Calloway has the local law in his pocket, but the federal boys answer to a different master. Hope flickered in Wilhelmina's heart for the first time in weeks. Prescott is 3 days' ride from here. too if you push it, Miller corrected, but Calloway's men are watching the main trails. He glanced at Xavier. Thought maybe you might know a less traveled route, Thornton, being that you used to scout for the cavalry. Xavier's eyebrows rose slightly at the sheriff's knowledge of his past. I might, he acknowledged, but Mrs. Parker's mare is in no condition for hard traveling and the baby complicates things. I'm aware, Miller said dryly. That's why I brought a packhorse with supplies. Figure you're going with her. Xavier and Wilhelmina exchanged surprised looks. I've imposed enough on Mr. Thornton's kindness, Wilhelmina began. Wasn't asking, Miller cut in. I'm deputizing him. He reached into his pocket and produced a badge. Temporary, of course. Xavier didn't reach for the badge. You're putting a lot of faith in a man you barely know, Sheriff. Miller's mouth twitched beneath his beard. I know enough. Know you fought with honor in the war. Know you've never broken the law in my jurisdiction. And know you wouldn't have hidden Mrs. Parker from Calloway's men if you didn't believe her story. A heavy silence filled the cabin. Wilhelmina looked between the two men, cradling Sarah protectively against her chest. I can't ask you to risk your life, she said quietly to Xavier. You've done more than enough already. Xavier's blue eyes met hers, and something in them made her breath catch. You're not asking, he said simply. I'm offering. He turned back to the sheriff and held out his hand for the badge. We'll leave at first light, less chance of being spotted. Miller nodded, satisfied. I'll do what I can to send Calloway's men in the wrong direction. Make it look like you headed south toward the border. After the sheriff departed, promising to return in a month's time to retrieve his deputy, Xavier busied himself gathering supplies for their journey. Wilhelmina watched him move about the cabin with efficient purpose, checking ammunition, packing dried food, filling canteens. Why are you doing this? She finally asked. You don't know me. This isn't your fight. Xavier paused in his preparations, considering her question. Maybe I've seen too many men like Calloway get away with evil because good folks were afraid to stand against them. Something in his voice suggested personal experience, but Wilhelmina didn't press. Instead, she said, you could be killed. So could you, he replied matter-of-factly. And that little one deserves a chance to grow up with her mother. He resumed his packing, adding, besides, I've been meaning to visit Prescott. Good time of year for it. His attempt at lightness brought a small smile to Wilhelmina's lips, the first in longer than she could remember. She found herself studying him as he worked, noting the quiet competence in his movements, the strength in his hands, the kindness that seemed to underlie his every action. You need rest, Xavier said, catching her watching him. Take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire. Wilhelmina started to protest, but exhaustion was dragging at her limbs, making her eyelids heavy. Just for a few hours, she conceded. Xavier showed her to the cabin's single bedroom, a simple space with a sturdy bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window. I'll keep watch, he assured her. No one will get near without my knowing. For the first time in 2 weeks, Wilhelmina laid down on a real bed. Sarah nestled beside her in a makeshift cradle Xavier had fashioned from a drawer. Despite her fears and uncertainties about the journey ahead, sleep claimed her almost instantly. She woke sometime in the night to Sarah's hungry cries. As she sat up to prepare another bottle, she realized one had already been made and placed on the small table beside the bed, the milk still warm. Through the partially open door, she could see Xavier sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle by the light of a single lantern, his profile strong and watchful in the dim light. A strange feeling settled in her chest, not quite peace, for danger still surrounded them, but something like hope. Whatever lay ahead, she was no longer facing it alone. The sky was still dark when Xavier gently knocked on the bedroom door. Time to go, he said softly. Wilhelmina was already awake, having slept fitfully despite her exhaustion. She gathered Sarah, who blinked sleepily but remained mercifully quiet, and joined Xavier in the main room. He had laid out clothing on the back of a chair, a man's shirt, trousers, and a worn leather vest. These might help you travel more easily, he explained. They belonged to my sister when she worked the ranch with me. She's taller than you, but a belt should help with the trousers. Wilhelmina touched the garments gratefully. Practical riding clothes would indeed be easier than her tattered dress. Thank you. Xavier nodded, looking somewhat uncomfortable. I'll wait outside while you change." When Wilhelmina emerged from the cabin some minutes later, she felt like a different woman. The clothes were loose but serviceable, and she'd bound her hair tightly under a wide-brimmed hat Xavier had provided. Sarah was secured to her chest in a sling fashioned from a soft blanket, allowing Wilhelmina to keep both hands free if needed. Xavier gave her an appraising look in the pre-dawn light. "The less you look like a woman traveling with a baby, the better," he said. At a distance, you could pass for a young ranch hand. He led her to the barn, where 4 horses were saddled and ready. Penny, looking much recovered after a night of rest and food, nickered softly in recognition. Beside her stood a muscular buckskin gelding Xavier's mount, she presumed, and 2 sturdy pack horses laden with supplies. Sheriff Miller was generous with provisions, Xavier noted, adjusting a saddle strap. "We won't need to stop in any towns along the way." He helped Wilhelmina mount, then showed her how the sling could be adjusted to keep Sarah secure during the ride. "The trail I'm planning is rough in places, but it shaves nearly half a day off the journey to Prescott. We'll stay in the high country, away from the main routes." As the first pale light of dawn crept over the eastern mountains, they set out, leaving the safety of Xavier's homestead behind. He led them through a narrow draw behind the cabin, following what appeared to be a game trail that wound up into the pine-covered hills. They rode in silence as the sun rose, Wilhelmina marveling at how quickly Xavier's cabin disappeared from view, hidden by the terrain as if it had never existed. He clearly knew this land intimately, guiding them through passages that seemed impassable until they were through them, avoiding exposed ridgelines where they might be spotted from below. By mid-morning, they had climbed high enough that Wilhelmina could see for miles across the territory rolling hills giving way to distant mesas, the land painted in shades of rust and gold in the autumn light. Sarah had settled into the rhythm of the horse's movement, sleeping peacefully against her mother's chest. "It's beautiful," Wilhelmina said when they paused to rest the horses near a small spring. "I never saw much beyond Silver Creek." Xavier nodded, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. "Territory's got its own kind of beauty, harsh but honest." He filled their canteens from the spring. "Your husband, he wasn't from around here originally." "No," Wilhelmina replied, stretching her legs. "Thomas was from Boston, came west with the mining company 5 years ago." A sad smile touched her lips. "He loved it here, said the land spoke to him in ways the city never did." "And you?" Xavier asked. "Where did you call home before Silver Creek?" "Philadelphia," she answered. "My father was a shopkeeper there. After he died, I came west to teach school." She laughed softly at Xavier's surprised expression. "Yes, I was a school teacher before I was a wife and mother. Thomas and I met when he came to lecture the children about geology." Xavier handed her a strip of jerky and a biscuit. "You miss teaching." Wilhelmina considered the question as she chewed. "I miss the children, the way their faces light up when they understand something new." She glanced down at Sarah. "I suppose I'll have my own students soon enough. You plan to stay in San Francisco with your cousin?" Xavier asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I don't know," Wilhelmina admitted. "I haven't thought beyond getting there safely." She looked at him curiously. "What about you? Have you always lived in the territory?" Xavier was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the distant horizon. "Born in Kentucky. Came west after the war." Something in his voice told Wilhelmina not to press further about that particular chapter of his life. Instead, she asked, "And your ranch, you built it yourself?" This brought a genuine smile to his face. "Every log. Took 3 years to get it right. Started with just the barn and a tent." He took a drink from his canteen. "My sister Julia helped when she could. Her husband works the railroads, so she'd stay with me between his jobs until they had children." "It's a lovely home," Wilhelmina said sincerely. "It suits me," Xavier replied with a shrug, though she could see the pride in his eyes. "We should move on. Want to reach Walker's Pass before dark." They continued their journey through increasingly rugged terrain, Xavier leading them along ridge lines and through narrow canyons that Wilhelmina would never have found on her own. Occasionally, he would stop, listening intently or studying the ground for signs of other travelers, but they encountered no one. Late in the afternoon, Sarah began to fuss, hungry and uncomfortable from the long ride. They stopped in a sheltered hollow where a cluster of cottonwood trees provided shade and concealment. "We'll rest here for an hour," Xavier decided. The horses could use it, and so could the little one. While Wilhelmina fed and changed Sarah, Xavier prepared a small, nearly smokeless fire to heat coffee. The domestic scene felt strangely comfortable, as if they had traveled together for years rather than hours. "How did you learn to move through the wilderness like this?" Wilhelmina asked, rejoining him by the fire with Sarah cradled in her arms. "Scouted for the Union Army during the war," Xavier replied. "Afterward did some work for the cavalry out here, tracking hostiles mostly." A shadow crossed his face. "Quit when I realized we were hunting families, not warriors." Wilhelmina studied him in the dappled light filtering through the cottonwood leaves. "You're a good man, Xavier Thornton." He looked uncomfortable with the compliment. "I try to do what's right, don't always succeed." "You've done right by us," she said softly. Their eyes met over the small fire, and something passed between them, a current of understanding and perhaps something more. Xavier was the first to look away, clearing his throat. "We should reach Walker's Pass by nightfall," he said, returning to practicalities. "There's a cave there where we can shelter, more defensible than camping in the open." They set out again, the terrain growing steeper as they approached the pass. The horses picked their way carefully over loose shale and around massive boulders. Sarah, lulled by the motion, slept against Wilhelmina's chest. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Xavier raised his hand for a halt. He dismounted quickly, motioning for Wilhelmina to do the same. "What is it?" she whispered, sliding carefully from the saddle. "Smoke," he replied quietly, pointing to a thin gray column rising from beyond the next ridge. "Could be travelers, could be Calloway's men." Leading the horses, they crept forward until they could peer over the ridge. In the small valley below, 3 men had made camp beside a stream, the same men who had come to Xavier's cabin the previous day. "How did they get ahead of us?" Wilhelmina breathed, fear clutching at her heart. "They didn't," Xavier said grimly. "They doubled back, probably after finding no sign of you on the trail to Copper Springs." He studied their position. "They're camped right in the middle of the pass, no way around without adding a day to our journey. What do we do?" Wilhelmina asked, unconsciously holding Sarah tighter. Xavier considered their options. "We wait until dark. They'll be looking for a woman traveling alone or maybe with a single companion, not a couple of ranch hands moving stock." As dusk deepened into night, they prepared for their deception. Xavier gave Wilhelmina one of his spare shirts to drape over Sarah, concealing her completely. "Keep her against your chest," he instructed. "If she starts to cry, you'll have to muffle it somehow." He then redistributed their packs to make it appear they were simply moving supplies. "Stay close to me. Let me do the talking. If anything happens, you ride hard for the North Ridge and don't look back." Wilhelmina nodded, her mouth dry with fear. "I won't leave you," she said with quiet determination. Xavier looked at her for a long moment, then reached out to adjust her hat lower over her eyes. "You've got grit, Mrs. Parker." Under the cover of darkness, they mounted and began their descent toward the pass. Xavier had extinguished their lantern, forcing them to rely on the horses' surer night vision and the faint starlight filtering through scattered clouds. As they approached the men's camp, Xavier began whistling a trail song, deliberately making noise as any innocent traveler might. The men below stirred, one rising to his feet and peering into the darkness. "Who goes there?" he called out, hand moving to his holstered pistol. "Just passing through," Xavier replied easily, guiding his horse into the circle of their firelight, moving supplies to the double R. The man squinted suspiciously as Wilhelmina followed Xavier into the light, keeping her head down and her body curved protectively around the hidden baby. "Bit late for traveling," another of the men commented, standing now. Wilhelmina recognized him as the leader from the previous day, though he showed no sign of recognizing Xavier in the dim light. "Got a late start," Xavier shrugged. "Boss won't be happy if these supplies don't make it by tomorrow." The third man had remained seated, but now he rose slowly, his hand resting on his gun. "You look familiar, mister." Xavier kept his expression neutral, Got that kind of face, I guess. The leader stepped closer, eyes narrowed. Take off your hat. Wilhelmina's heart hammered in her chest. Sarah shifted against her, making a small sound that was thankfully lost in the crackle of the campfire. Xavier removed his hat casually, revealing his face fully to the firelight. Something wrong. The leader studied him intently, then glanced at Wilhelmina, who kept her face averted. Your friend's shy. New hand, Xavier explained. Young Jimmy here don't talk much. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Then abruptly the leader stepped back. You seen a woman on the trail, traveling with a baby, Xavier shook his head. Haven't seen anyone for 2 days. Roads are quiet this time of year. The men exchanged glances, clearly uncertain. Well, if you do spot her, there's good money for information. She's wanted for murder. That's so, Xavier replaced his hat. I'll keep an eye out. But right now, we need to make some miles before my boy here falls asleep in the saddle. The leader reluctantly stepped aside. Pass on through, but remember what I said about the reward. Xavier touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then nudged his horse forward. Wilhelmina followed, keeping her head down, every muscle tense as they passed between the armed men. They continued at a steady pace until the campfire was well behind them, neither speaking until they were certain they were out of earshot. That was too close, Wilhelmina whispered when they finally stopped in a shelter draw a mile beyond the pass. Xavier nodded, his face grim in the starlight. They're not giving up. He glanced over his shoulder. And I'm not sure they were entirely convinced. What do we do now? Push harder, Xavier decided. Ride through the night. Put as much distance between us and them as possible. And so they did, following game trails and dried creek beds, navigating by starlight through terrain that would have been challenging even in daylight. Xavier led with unerring confidence, occasionally dismounting to check their direction or listen for pursuit. Wilhelmina fought exhaustion, focusing on keeping Sarah comfortable and quiet. The baby, remarkably, seemed to sense the need for silence, making only occasional whimpers that Wilhelmina quickly soothed. As dawn approached, they reached a high plateau overlooking a vast expanse of wilderness. In the far distance, Wilhelmina could just make out wisps of smoke rising from what must be chimneys. Prescott, Xavier confirmed, following her gaze. We'll reach it by midday if we push on. Wilhelmina swayed slightly in the saddle, fatigue making her dizzy. Xavier was at her side immediately, his hand steady on her arm. We'll rest here for an hour, he said, his voice brooking no argument. You need sleep, even if just a little. He helped her dismount and led her to a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging rock. From their saddlebags, he produced a blanket which he spread on the ground. Sleep, he instructed. I'll keep watch. Too exhausted to protest, Wilhelmina laid down with Sarah beside her. She was asleep almost instantly, the weight of constant vigilance temporarily lifted from her shoulders. She woke to Sarah's hungry cries and the smell of coffee. Xavier had built another small fire and was heating water for the baby's formula. Any sign of pursuit? Wilhelmina asked, sitting up stiffly. Xavier shook his head. Nothing so far, but we shouldn't linger. He handed her the prepared bottle. The marshal's office is on the north side of town. We'll approach from the east, avoid the main roads. As Sarah drank her formula, Wilhelmina studied Xavier's profile against the lightening sky. There were lines of fatigue around his eyes, and she realized he hadn't slept at all during their journey. You should rest too, she said gently. Just for a little while. Xavier shook his head. I'll rest when we reach Prescott. He poured her a cup of coffee. Drink this, it'll help. The coffee was strong and bitter, but Wilhelmina welcomed its warmth and the alertness it brought. As she drank, she found herself contemplating what lay ahead. If the marshal believed her story and Thomas's evidence, Calloway might finally face justice. But what then? Where would she and Sarah go? And what of Xavier? Would he simply return to his solitary life at the cabin once his duty was fulfilled? The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. In the short time she'd known him, Xavier Thornton had become more than just her protector. He had become someone she trusted, someone whose presence brought comfort in the midst of danger. What will you do? She asked suddenly. After Prescott, I mean. Xavier looked surprised by the question. Haven't thought that far ahead, he admitted. Get you and the little one safely to the marshal, then, he shrugged. Back to the ranch, I suppose. Wilhelmina nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. Of course he would return home. What had she expected? They broke camp shortly after, packing away all evidence of their presence. The final leg of their journey took them down from the high country into rolling grasslands dotted with ponderosa pines. As they drew closer to Prescott, they began to encounter signs of civilization: fenced pastures, the occasional distant farmhouse, a wagon on the road far below. Xavier led them on a circuitous route that kept them away from the main trails, though it added miles to their journey. By the time the buildings of Prescott came fully into view, the sun was high overhead. We'll approach from the east, Xavier decided. Less traffic that way. They skirted the outskirts of town, keeping to tree lines and gullies where possible. Prescott was larger than Wilhelmina had expected a proper town, with wooden sidewalks, multi-story buildings, and a surprising amount of activity for a frontier settlement. Xavier pointed out a large brick building flying an American flag. Marshal's office, he said. But we can't just ride up to the front door. Not with Calloway's men possibly in town. They left the horses tethered in a stand of trees behind a livery stable and proceeded on foot, Wilhelmina still dressed in her male disguise with Sarah hidden beneath the oversized shirt. Xavier led her through narrow alleys between buildings until they reached the rear entrance of the marshal's office. Wait here, he instructed, positioning her in a shadowed doorway. I'll make sure it's safe. Wilhelmina watched anxiously as Xavier approached the back door of the building and knocked. After a brief conversation with someone inside, he motioned for her to join him. The man who had answered the door was tall and lean, with a steel-gray mustache and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He wore a marshal's badge on his vest. Mrs. Parker, he said with a nod as Wilhelmina entered. Marshal James Harker, Sheriff Miller sent a telegram about your situation. His eyes moved to the bundle against her chest, and this must be the little one. Wilhelmina uncovered Sarah, who blinked in the sudden light. Yes, this is my daughter, Sarah. Marshal Harker led them through a short hallway into a private office, closing the door firmly behind them. Sheriff Miller mentioned evidence against Frank Calloway, he said without preamble. I'd like to see it. Wilhelmina produced Thomas's letter, and the documents it contained detailed records of falsified assay reports, unsafe mining practices, and bribes paid to local officials. The marshal read through them carefully, his expression grave. Your husband was a thorough man, he commented when he'd finished. This is damning evidence, but it won't be enough on its own. Wilhelmina's heart sank. What do you mean? I mean Calloway has friends in high places, Harker explained. To bring him down, we need witnesses willing to testify, corroborating evidence. He tapped the papers. This is a start, but only a start. Then it was all for nothing, Wilhelmina said, despair washing over her. He'll still come after us. I didn't say that, the marshal countered. I said we need more evidence, and I believe we can get it. He looked at Xavier. Sheriff Miller thinks highly of you, Thornton, says you're a man who can be trusted. Xavier nodded cautiously. Miller's a good judge of character. Then perhaps you'd consider extending your deputy status a bit longer, Harker suggested. I need someone to escort Mrs. Parker to San Francisco. San Francisco, Wilhelmina repeated, confused. But I thought the federal prosecutor for the Western Territories is based there, Harker explained. He's been building a case against several mining operations for years. Your husband's evidence could be the missing piece he needs. Hope flickered in Wilhelmina's chest. So we continue to San Francisco, on the next stagecoach, Harker confirmed, which leaves tomorrow morning. He turned to Xavier. I can assign one of my deputies, but given the sensitive nature of the evidence and the potential danger from Calloway's men. I'll go, Xavier said without hesitation. The marshal nodded, satisfied. I'll arrange your passage and provide official documentation. In the meantime, you'll stay at the widow Holcomb's boarding house. It's discreet, and she doesn't ask questions. He scribbled an address on a piece of paper and handed it to Xavier. Use the back streets. I'll have one of my men bring your horses around after dark. As they prepared to leave, Harker added, Calloway's men were in town yesterday, asking questions. They're offering $1,000 now for information on your whereabouts, Mrs. Parker. Be careful. The widow Holcomb's boarding house was a modest two-story structure on a quiet side street. The widow herself was a plump, cheerful woman who, true to the marshal's word, asked no questions when Xavier requested a room for himself and his sister and her child. Their room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a rocking chair beside the window. A trundle bed could be pulled out from beneath the main bed if needed. "It's not much," Xavier apologized as the widow left them to settle in. "It's perfect," Wilhelmina assured him, sinking gratefully into the rocking chair with Sarah in her arms. After sleeping on the ground, any real bed seems luxurious. Xavier set their few belongings in the corner and checked the window, which overlooked a small garden. "I'll take the trundle," he said. "You and Sarah take the bed." Wilhelmina nodded, too tired to argue about sleeping arrangements. Now that they had reached relative safety, the adrenaline that had sustained her was fading rapidly, leaving her almost dizzy with exhaustion. "You should rest," Xavier said, noticing her drooping eyelids. "I'll go see about getting us some food." When he had gone, Wilhelmina laid Sarah on the bed and quickly washed her face and hands in the basin. The water was cool and refreshing, and she allowed herself the small luxury of loosening her hair from its tight braid and combing it with her fingers. She had just settled on the bed with Sarah when Xavier returned, carrying a tray with bowls of stew, bread, and 2 glasses of milk. "Mrs. Holcomb sends her regards," he said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "And says there's a bath available downstairs later if you're interested." The thought of a real bath after days on the trail was almost too wonderful to contemplate. "That sounds heavenly," Wilhelmina admitted. They ate in companionable silence, the simple meal tasting better than any fine dining Wilhelmina could remember. Sarah dozed peacefully on the bed, occasionally making small sighing sounds in her sleep. "You should go first," Xavier said when they had finished eating. "To the bath, I mean." "I'll watch over Sarah." Wilhelmina hesitated. "Are you sure? You must be exhausted too." "I'm fine," he assured her. "Go on, take your time." The bath was everything Wilhelmina had hoped for: hot water, real soap, and blissful privacy. She soaked until her fingers wrinkled, washing away the dust and fear of their journey. Mrs. Holcomb had even provided a clean nightgown and robe, simple but soft and smelling of lavender. When she returned to their room, feeling human again for the first time in days, she found Xavier sitting in the rocking chair with Sarah cradled in his arms. He was speaking to the baby in a low, gentle voice, telling her about the stars and how cowboys used them to find their way home. The sight stopped Wilhelmina in the doorway, a lump forming in her throat. There was something so natural, so right about the picture they made this strong, silent man holding her daughter with such tenderness. Xavier looked up as she entered, and something flickered in his eyes, an expression Wilhelmina couldn't quite read. "She was fussing," he explained. "Hope you don't mind." "Of course not," Wilhelmina said softly, moving to take Sarah from him. "Thank you for watching her." Their hands brushed as she took the baby, and Wilhelmina felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with gratitude. For a moment, neither of them moved, their eyes locked in silent communication. Xavier was the first to break the contact, clearing his throat and standing. "I should go clean up," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Get some rest, Mrs. Parker. Tomorrow will be a long day." "Wilhelmina," she said impulsively. "Please call me Wilhelmina." He paused at the door, looking back at her with those clear blue eyes. "Wilhelmina," he repeated, her name sounding different, special in his deep voice. Then he was gone, closing the door softly behind him. Wilhelmina settled into the bed with Sarah beside her, her mind and heart too full for immediate sleep despite her exhaustion. In just a few days, her life had been completely transformed from desperate flight to cautious hope, from complete isolation to whatever this growing connection with Xavier might be. She wasn't naive enough to call it love. How could it be in such a short time and under such circumstances? And yet, there was something between them, a bond forged in danger and trust that felt stronger than many relationships built over years. Tomorrow, they would board the stagecoach for San Francisco, continuing their journey together. But what would happen when they reached their destination? Would Xavier simply return to his solitary life once his duty was fulfilled? The thought brought an unexpected ache to Wilhelmina's heart. She was still pondering these questions when sleep finally claimed her. Her last conscious thought the memory of Xavier's strong hands cradling her daughter with such gentle care. She woke to soft morning light filtering through the curtains and the smell of coffee. Xavier sat in the rocking chair by the window, already dressed and alert, a cup in his hand. "Good morning," he said quietly, mindful of the still sleeping Sarah. Mrs. Holcomb brought breakfast. Stage leaves in 2 hours. Wilhelmina sat up, brushing hair from her face. "Have you been awake long?" "A while," he admitted. "Force of habit." She noticed the shadows beneath his eyes and realized he probably hadn't slept much, if at all. "Xavier, you need to rest too. You can't keep going like this." A small smile touched his lips. "I'll sleep on the stage," he promised. "Assuming your daughter allows it." As if on cue, Sarah stirred and began to fuss. Wilhelmina lifted her, checking her diaper. "She's hungry," she explained. Reaching for the bottle Xavier had already prepared, he stood, setting down his coffee. "I'll give you some privacy," he said, moving toward the door. "No need," Wilhelmina replied. "We've shared far closer quarters on the trail." She settled back against the pillows with Sarah, feeling strangely comfortable in Xavier's presence despite her disheveled state. Xavier remained by the window, his gaze politely averted as Wilhelmina fed the baby. "Marshal Harker sent word this morning," he said. "Our passage is arranged under different names. As far as anyone knows, we're Mr. and Mrs. James Wilson traveling with our daughter to visit family in San Francisco." "Mr. and Mrs.," Wilhelmina repeated softly, the words sending an unexpected warmth through her. "It's safer that way," Xavier explained, perhaps misinterpreting her tone. "A family draws less attention than a single woman with a deputy escort." "Of course," she agreed quickly. "It makes perfect sense." After breakfast, Wilhelmina dressed in clothes Mrs. Holcomb had provided, a simple but respectable traveling dress and bonnet that would help her blend in with other stagecoach passengers. Xavier, too, had obtained new attire, exchanging his trail-worn clothes for a clean shirt, vest, and trousers that made him look more like a businessman than a cowboy, though he kept his familiar hat. "Your gun?" Wilhelmina asked, noticing its absence from his hip. "Hidden," he replied, lifting his vest slightly to reveal the weapon tucked into a shoulder holster. "Less conspicuous this way." Marshal Harker met them at the stagecoach office, handing Xavier a sealed packet. "Deliver this directly to Prosecutor Hamilton in San Francisco," he instructed. "No one else." He turned to Wilhelmina, his expression grave but kind. "Mrs. Parker, what you're doing takes remarkable courage. Your husband would be proud." The words brought unexpected tears to Wilhelmina's eyes. "Thank you, Marshal." The stagecoach was already loaded with other passengers when they arrived, a middle-aged couple, a young man who appeared to be a clerk of some kind, and an elderly woman with knitting in her lap. All regarded the newcomers with polite curiosity, particularly Sarah, who was wide awake and observing everything with bright eyes. "What a lovely child," the elderly woman commented as Xavier helped Wilhelmina and Sarah into the coach. "How old is she?" 3 months, Wilhelmina replied with a smile, settling into her seat with Sarah on her lap. "Traveling at such a young age," the woman clucked sympathetically. "But children are remarkably resilient, aren't they?" Xavier took the seat beside Wilhelmina, his solid presence reassuring as the stagecoach lurched into motion. The journey to San Francisco would take several days, with overnight stops at way stations along the route. It would be a far different experience than their desperate ride through the wilderness, more comfortable physically, perhaps, but also more public and potentially more dangerous if Calloway's men were watching the main routes. As the stagecoach rattled through the streets of Prescott, Wilhelmina found herself tensing at each passing rider, each face that turned toward the vehicle. Xavier seemed to sense her anxiety, his hand covering hers briefly in a gesture of reassurance. "We're just one more family heading west," he murmured for her ears alone. "Nothing remarkable about us at all." Wilhelmina nodded, forcing herself to relax and smile as if she were indeed merely a wife traveling with her husband. It wasn't a difficult pretense to maintain, she found. There was something strangely natural about sitting beside Xavier, about the way he leaned slightly toward her in the swaying coach, about the gentle way he occasionally touched Sarah's tiny hand. The first day of travel passed without incident. Sarah, to Wilhelmina's relief, seemed to enjoy the motion of the coach, sleeping for much of the journey and waking only to be fed or changed. The other passengers were friendly but not overly inquisitive, accepting the story that the Wilsons were traveling to visit family in San Francisco. Xavier remained vigilant but outwardly relaxed, occasionally engaging in conversation with the other male passengers about business conditions or the weather. To anyone watching, he appeared to be nothing more than a devoted husband and father. They stopped for the night at a small way station, little more than a sturdy building with a common dining room and several small bedrooms. The accommodations were basic but clean, and the elderly woman, Mrs. Abernathy, kindly helped Wilhelmina settle Sarah while Xavier brought in their few belongings. Alone in their small room after dinner, with Sarah finally asleep in a makeshift cradle, Wilhelmina found herself acutely aware of Xavier's presence. The room contained only one narrow bed, a chair, and a small washstand. "I'll take the chair," Xavier said immediately, seeing her discomfort. "Don't be ridiculous," Wilhelmina protested. "You've barely slept in days, you need proper rest." "I've slept in worse places," he assured her. Wilhelmina sighed in exasperation. "This is absurd. The bed is small but adequate for two, and we're both adults. I trust you completely, Xavier." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim lamplight. "If you're certain." "I am," she said firmly, though her heart beat a little faster at the thought. They arranged themselves awkwardly on the narrow bed, both fully clothed except for their boots, with a folded blanket placed between them as an improvised barrier. Despite the physical separation, Wilhelmina was intensely conscious of Xavier's warmth, his steady breathing, the clean scent of soap and male skin. "Good night, Wilhelmina," he said softly. "Good night, Xavier," she replied, oddly comforted by his presence despite her awareness of him. To her surprise, she slept deeply and dreamlessly, waking only when Sarah began to stir at dawn. Xavier was already up, standing by the window and looking out at the early morning landscape. "Everything all right?" Wilhelmina asked, sitting up and reaching for Sarah. He nodded, turning to face her. "Just checking the weather, looks like rain later." But something in his expression suggested he'd been watching for more than clouds. "Did you see something?" she asked, suddenly alert. "Not exactly," he replied, "just a feeling we should be careful today." The stagecoach departed after a hasty breakfast, continuing westward through increasingly mountainous terrain. The clerk and the middle-aged couple had left the stage at Prescott, replaced by a well-dressed gentleman who introduced himself as a mining investor, and a young woman traveling to meet her fiancé in California. Xavier seemed particularly watchful of the mining investor, though the man appeared harmless enough, spending most of the journey reading a newspaper or dozing. When they stopped to change horses at midday, Xavier quietly asked Wilhelmina to remain in the coach with Sarah while he stretched his legs. Through the window, she watched him casually circling the way station, his eyes constantly moving, observing everything and everyone. When he returned, his expression was grim. "What is it?" she whispered as he settled beside her. "Two riders watching the station from the ridge," he murmured. "Could be nothing. Could be Calloway's men." Wilhelmina's arms tightened around Sarah. "What do we do?" "Stay with the stage for now," Xavier decided. "If they are Calloway's men, they're likely watching all travelers, not just us specifically. Our disguise as a family should hold." But as the journey resumed, Wilhelmina could feel Xavier's tension beside her, his hand never far from his concealed weapon. The easy conversation that had characterized the previous day's travel was notably absent, the atmosphere in the coach subdued. The mining investor seemed to notice the change. "Something troubling you, Mr. Wilson?" he inquired politely. Xavier gave him a measured look. "Just eager to reach our destination, sir." "Aren't we all?" the man replied with a thin smile. Family in San Francisco, I understand. My wife's cousin, Xavier answered, his tone discouraging further questions. The investor nodded and returned to his newspaper, but not before Wilhelmina caught a calculating look in his eyes that sent a chill down her spine. As the afternoon wore on, dark clouds gathered overhead, and rain began to fall, first as a gentle patter on the coach roof, then as a steady downpour that turned the road to mud and slowed their progress considerably. "We'll be late reaching the next station," the driver called down during one particularly rough stretch. "Might have to stop before dark if this keeps up." Xavier exchanged a glance with Wilhelmina, his concern evident. Being stranded in the open would make them vulnerable, especially if they were indeed being followed. The rain continued relentlessly, and as predicted, the driver was forced to halt well before reaching the scheduled stop. They took shelter in an abandoned line shack, little more than a crude shelter with a leaking roof and dirt floor, but at least it offered some protection from the elements. "Not exactly the Palmer House," the mining investor commented dryly, looking around the primitive accommodation with distaste. Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly woman, was more philosophical. "Better than being out in that deluge," she said, settling herself on a rough bench and resuming her knitting. The driver and guard brought in provisions from the coach: jerky, hardtack, and a bottle of whiskey that was passed around to ward off the chill. Xavier declined, remaining near the door where he could watch the road while appearing to merely stretch his legs. Wilhelmina sat with Sarah on a relatively clean corner of the floor, trying to keep the baby warm and dry. The young woman traveling to meet her fiancé, Mary, joined her, offering a spare shawl to wrap around the infant. "She's so beautiful," Mary said, smiling at Sarah. "You must be very proud." "Thank you," Wilhelmina replied, touched by the girl's kindness. "We are." "How long have you and Mr. Wilson been married?" Mary asked innocently. The question caught Wilhelmina off guard. "Just over a year," she improvised, hoping Xavier hadn't given a different answer to someone else. "A love match, I can tell," Mary said with romantic conviction. "The way he looks at you." Wilhelmina felt her cheeks warm. "We're very fortunate," she said softly, her eyes seeking Xavier across the cramped space. He was engaged in conversation with the driver, but as if sensing her gaze, he looked up, their eyes meeting in silent communication. Something in his expression made her breath catch a warmth, a protectiveness, and perhaps something more that she dared not name. The mining investor had been watching this exchange with interest. "Newlyweds?" he asked, moving to sit near them. "Not exactly," Wilhelmina replied, suddenly wary of his attention. "Forgive my curiosity," the man said smoothly. "I've been traveling alone so long, I find myself fascinated by the stories of my fellow passengers." He extended his hand. "Edward Winters, at your service." Wilhelmina reluctantly shook his hand. "Alice Wilson," she said, using the first name Xavier had chosen for their disguise. "And that strapping husband of yours, James, isn't it?" Winters continued. "What business brings him to San Francisco?" Before Wilhelmina could answer, Xavier was suddenly there, sitting beside her with casual possessiveness. "Family matters," he said shortly, "nothing of interest to others." Winters raised an eyebrow at Xavier's tone but withdrew gracefully. "Of course. Forgive my intrusion." The atmosphere in the small shack grew tense as the evening wore on, and the rain showed no sign of abating. The driver and guard took turns keeping watch, but Xavier remained alert as well, his body a protective barrier between Wilhelmina and the rest of the group. "You should try to sleep," he murmured to her as the others settled down for the night, arranging themselves as comfortably as possible on the hard floor. "So should you," she countered, though she knew it was futile. Xavier wouldn't rest, not when he sensed danger nearby. They sat side by side against the wall, Sarah sleeping between them wrapped in Mary's shawl and Wilhelmina's cloak. Despite the discomfort and worry, Wilhelmina found herself drawing strength from Xavier's steady presence, from the quiet determination that seemed to radiate from him. "Thank you," she whispered when the others appeared to be asleep, "for everything." In the dim light of the single lantern, she saw his profile soften. "No need for thanks," he replied quietly. "There is," she insisted. "You've risked everything for us, your home, your safety. Why?" Xavier was silent for so long that Wilhelmina thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "During the war, I saw what happens when good people do nothing in the face of evil. I swore I'd never be that man." He looked down at Sarah, sleeping peacefully between them. And then there's her. Every child deserves a chance at life, at happiness. Impulsively, Wilhelmina reached for his hand in the darkness, her fingers twining with his. "You're a good man, Xavier Thornton," she said again, meaning it more deeply than before. His hand tightened around hers, and for a long moment they sat in silence, connected by more than just their clasped hands. A sudden noise outside broke the spell, the sound of horses approaching through the rain. Xavier was on his feet instantly, gun drawn, moving to the window. "Everyone stay down," he ordered quietly as the driver and guard also rose, weapons ready. The others woke at the commotion, the women drawing together instinctively while Winters pressed himself against the wall beside the door. "How many?" the guard asked Xavier in a low voice. "3 riders," Xavier replied, peering through a crack in the shutters, moving slow, searching. Wilhelmina clutched Sarah to her chest, heart pounding. If these were Calloway's men, they were trapped. The small shack offered little protection and no escape route. The riders drew closer, their voices now audible over the rain rough, impatient voices discussing whether to check the abandoned structure or continue on. "We know you're in there, Mrs. Parker," one of the men finally called out. "Just come on out with the baby and nobody else gets hurt." A collective gasp went through the small group, all eyes turning to Wilhelmina in shock and confusion. "Mrs. Parker," Mary whispered, bewildered. "But I thought it's a mistake," the driver said firmly, though he gave Wilhelmina a hard look. "Ain't nobody here by that name." Outside, the men dismounted. "We've tracked you all the way from Prescott," the voice continued. "We know you're traveling with a man. Send him out first, hands empty, or we start shooting." Xavier met Wilhelmina's terrified eyes across the room, his expression resolute. "Stay down," he mouthed to her, then moved toward the door. "What are you doing?" she whispered frantically. "Creating a distraction," he replied, so softly only she could hear. "When it happens, get ready to run for the coach with Sarah. The driver will help you." Before she could protest, Xavier was conferring quietly with the driver and guard, who nodded grimly. "All right," Xavier called through the door. "I'm coming out, don't shoot." "Xavier, no," Wilhelmina cried, but he was already opening the door, stepping out into the rain with his hands raised. Through the crack in the door, she could see the 3 men, Calloway's foreman, and 2 others, their guns trained on Xavier. "Where is she?" the foreman demanded. "Who?" Xavier replied calmly. "Don't play dumb, Cowboy. Wilhelmina Parker, the woman you've been helping escape." Xavier shrugged, seemingly relaxed despite the weapons pointed at him. "Don't know anyone by that name. I'm James Wilson, traveling with my wife and child to San Francisco." The foreman spat on the ground. "You're lying." Winters confirmed it was her. Wilhelmina's blood ran cold as the pieces fell into place. The mining investor, his 2 convenient questions, his interest in their destination. He had been working for Calloway all along. Inside the shack, the others turned to where Winters had been standing, but the man was nowhere to be seen. He must have slipped out during the confusion. "Traitor," Mrs. Abernathy hissed, surprisingly fierce for her grandmotherly appearance. Outside, Xavier was still talking, keeping the men's attention focused on him. "I don't know what game you're playing, mister, but you're mistaken. There's just my wife, our baby, and a few other passengers in there. Search the place," the foreman ordered one of his men. As the man moved toward the door, Xavier made his move. In one fluid motion, he dropped to the ground, drew his hidden weapon, and fired. The shot caught the approaching man in the shoulder, spinning him around. The guard inside burst through the door at the same moment, his shotgun booming in the rainy night. The foreman dove for cover, returning fire wildly. "Now." The driver shouted to Wilhelmina, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the back of the shack where a crude window offered escape. "Go with them," Mrs. Abernathy urged, remarkably steady as she pushed Mary toward Wilhelmina. "Help her with the baby." Clutching Sarah tightly, Wilhelmina allowed herself to be hustled through the window, Mary right behind her. The driver led them at a crouching run toward the stagecoach, where the horses were stamping nervously at the sound of gunfire. Get in and stay down, he instructed, helping them into the vehicle. I'll get the team moving. But Xavier, Wilhelmina began. Your man knows what he's doing, the driver cut her off. He'll catch up. More shots rang out from the shack, and Wilhelmina caught a glimpse of Xavier moving from cover to cover, exchanging fire with the remaining men while the guard provided covering fire from the doorway. The driver had just mounted the box when one of Calloway's men spotted the movement by the coach and swung his rifle in their direction. Mary screamed as a bullet splintered the wood beside the window. Then Xavier was there, firing steadily as he backed toward the coach. Go! He shouted to the driver. Get them out of here. The driver cracked his whip and the team lurched forward into the rainy darkness. Wilhelmina reached out desperately as Xavier made a running leap for the moving vehicle, catching his arm and helping him haul himself inside. Are you hit? She asked frantically, searching his rain-soaked form for signs of injury. I'm fine, he assured her, though his breathing was labored. The guard, still at the shack with Mrs. Abernathy, Mary answered, peering fearfully out the window. I think they're all right. The men are chasing us. Indeed, they could hear hoofbeats behind them, gaining despite the coach's headlong pace through the muddy road. We can't outrun them, Xavier said grimly, checking his ammunition. Not in this weather, not with the coach fully loaded. Wilhelmina clutched Sarah tighter, the baby now fully awake and whimpering at the commotion. What do we do? Xavier's face was set in hard lines as he made a decision. There's a fork in the road about a mile ahead. When we reach it, you and Mary continue with the coach on the main road. I'll draw them off on the side trail. No, Wilhelmina protested. They'll kill you. They have to catch me first, Xavier replied with grim confidence. I know these mountains better than they do. You can't go alone, Wilhelmina insisted. We stay together, Wilhelmina. Xavier took her face in his hands, his eyes intense in the darkness of the swaying coach. I will find you, I promise, but right now Sarah needs you to be safe. The sound of her daughter's name broke through Wilhelmina's panic. She was right, Sarah's safety had to come first. Still, the thought of Xavier facing those men alone was almost unbearable. Promise me you'll be careful, she whispered. Instead of answering, Xavier did something completely unexpected. He leaned forward and kissed her, brief but fierce, his lips warm despite the cold rain that dripped from his hair. I'll find you, he repeated against her mouth. Then he was shouting instructions to the driver through the forward window, explaining his plan. The coach slowed slightly as they approached the fork, and Xavier prepared to jump. At the last moment, he turned back to Wilhelmina. The marshal in Sacramento will help you if I'm delayed, he said quickly. Tell him everything. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaping from the moving coach and disappearing into the rainy darkness. Moments later, they heard a shout and gunfire as Xavier deliberately revealed his position to their pursuers. The driver whipped the team to greater speed, and Wilhelmina watched in anguish as the sounds of pursuit faded behind them following Xavier, not the coach. He'll be all right, Mary said, squeezing Wilhelmina's hand. A man like that knows how to take care of himself. Wilhelmina nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. The kiss had taken her completely by surprise, not just the act itself, but the feelings it had awakened. In that brief moment, she had recognized the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling in love with Xavier Thornton. And now he was riding alone into danger, drawing their enemies away to protect her and Sarah. The coach continued through the night, the driver pushing the team as hard as he dared on the treacherous roads. By dawn, they had reached a proper way station where a contingent of cavalry was fortuitously present, returning to their fort after escort duty. When the driver explained the situation, leaving out certain details, but emphasizing that Mrs. Wilson and her baby were being pursued by dangerous men, the lieutenant in charge immediately offered protection for the remainder of their journey. My men will escort you to Sacramento, madam, he assured Wilhelmina. No one will harm you or your child. My husband, Wilhelmina said, the word feeling strange yet right on her lips. He stayed behind to draw off our pursuers. He may be in danger. The lieutenant nodded. I'll send 2 of my men back along the trail to look for him, he promised. What does he look like? Tall, broad-shouldered, Wilhelmina described. Dark hair, blue eyes, wearing a gray vest and black hat. He's armed. A capable man in a fight, the lieutenant asked. Very, Wilhelmina confirmed, clinging to that knowledge as a source of hope. With a military escort, the remainder of the journey to Sacramento passed without incident, though every hour without word of Xavier was torture for Wilhelmina. Mary stayed by her side, helping with Sarah and providing quiet support. He promised he would find you, the young woman reminded her. From what little I've seen of Mr. Thornton, he's not a man who breaks his promises. In Sacramento, Wilhelmina went directly to the marshal's office as Xavier had instructed. Marshal Hayes, a gruff but kind man in his 50s, listened to her story with growing concern. Frank Calloway's reach is long, he said when she had finished, but not longer than the law, not in my jurisdiction. He examined the evidence packet Xavier had been carrying. This, combined with your testimony, should be enough to at least open a formal investigation. And Xavier? Wilhelmina asked, the question that had been consuming her since they parted. Hayes sent telegrams to various lawmen along their route, including the lieutenant who had escorted them to Sacramento. We'll find him, Mrs. Parker, he assured her, dead or alive. The words sent a chill through Wilhelmina's heart. The possibility that Xavier might not have survived his diversion had been haunting her, but hearing it stated so baldly made it terrifyingly real. Marshal Hayes arranged secure lodging for Wilhelmina and Sarah in a boarding house run by his sister, a formidable widow named Mrs. Hollister. Mary, having decided to delay her journey to meet her fiancé, stayed with them, becoming a dear friend and helper with Sarah. Days passed with no word of Xavier. The cavalry patrol had found signs of a skirmish on the trail, blood on the ground, spent cartridges but no bodies, and no definitive evidence of what had occurred. Calloway's men had not been seen or heard from either, which the marshal took as a positive sign. If they'd gotten your man, they'd be crowing about it, he told Wilhelmina. The fact that they've gone to ground suggests he gave them a proper thrashing. She clung to this hope, focusing on caring for Sarah and preparing for their eventual journey to San Francisco. The prosecutor there had been informed of their situation and was eager to add Thomas's evidence to his case against the mining companies. On the 7th day after their separation, Wilhelmina was sitting in the boarding house parlor, Sarah asleep in her arms, when Mrs. Hollister entered with an unusually bright expression. "You have a visitor, my dear," she announced. "A rather dusty one, I might add." Wilhelmina looked up, hardly daring to hope, and there he was. Xavier stood in the doorway, his clothes trail worn and a bandage visible beneath his torn sleeve, but gloriously, wonderfully alive. "Xavier," she gasped, rising so quickly she nearly woke Sarah. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his eyes never leaving her face. "I promised I'd find you," he said simply. Wilhelmina wanted nothing more than to throw herself into his arms, but Sarah's presence between them made that impossible. Instead, she reached out with her free hand to touch his face, needing physical confirmation that he was really there. "You're hurt," she said, noting the bandage and the way he held himself carefully as if other injuries were hidden beneath his clothing. "Nothing serious," he assured her. "Your friends made sure of that." "My friends," Wilhelmina repeated, confused. Xavier's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Mrs. Abernathy is quite handy with a shotgun, as it turns out, and the stage guard is a former Army medic." Relief and joy bubbled up in Wilhelmina's chest, emerging as slightly hysterical laughter. "Mrs. Abernathy, with a shotgun." "Said she learned during the Gold Rush days," Xavier confirmed, his own smile widening. "She and the guard caught up to me after I led Calloway's men on a merry chase through the hills. Between the 3 of us, we convinced them to reconsider their employment options." "Are they?" Wilhelmina couldn't bring herself to finish the question. "Dead, no," Xavier's expression hardened slightly. "But they won't be causing trouble for a while. We left them trussed up for a cavalry patrol to find." His face softened as he looked down at Sarah. "How is she?" "Perfect," Wilhelmina replied, her eyes filling with tears of relief and happiness. "She's perfect, and now you're here and—" She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Xavier was here, yes, but what did that mean for their future? He had fulfilled his duty, delivered her and the evidence safely. What reason did he have to stay? As if reading her thoughts, Xavier took a step closer. Wilhelmina, he began, his voice unusually hesitant. I've been doing a lot of thinking during the past week about what happens next. Her heart beat faster. And what did you decide? That depends, he said carefully, on what you want. Wilhelmina took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I want what I've had these past days, she said softly. Safety for Sarah, purpose, and… She met his eyes steadily. And you, Xavier, if that's what you want too. The vulnerability in her voice seemed to break something open in him. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his calloused palm warm against her skin. I've never wanted anything more, he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. From the moment I saw you on that ridge, something in me knew. But I had no right to speak of it, not when you were running for your life, grieving your husband. Thomas would have liked you, Wilhelmina said, leaning into his touch. He valued honesty and courage above all things, like you. Xavier's thumb brushed her cheekbone gently. I can't replace him, he said seriously. Wouldn't try to. I'm not asking you to, she assured him. But Sarah needs a father and she swallowed hard. I find I need you, Xavier Thornton, more than I ever expected to need anyone again. The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then suddenly brilliant. Well then, Mrs. Parker, he said, his voice warm with promise, I believe we have plans to make. Sarah chose that moment to wake, blinking up at them with her clear blue eyes. Xavier tentatively reached out, and Wilhelmina placed the baby in his arms. He held her with practiced ease, looking down at her tiny face with an expression of wonder. Hello again, little one, he murmured. Seems like you and your mama might be stuck with me for a while. Sarah gurgled and caught his finger in her tiny fist, holding on with surprising strength. Looking at them together, Wilhelmina felt a sense of rightness, of completion, that she had feared lost forever after Thomas's death. This wasn't an ending to her journey, she realized, but a beginning unexpected and precious, born from danger and loss, but offering hope and love for the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Calloway's prosecution, building a new life, merging their separate paths into one they would face them together. You and that baby are safe here, Xavier had said when he first welcomed her into his home. She hadn't understood then how prophetic those words would prove to be, not just in the moment, but for all the days to come. 3 months later, on a clear spring morning, Wilhelmina Parker became Wilhelmina Thornton in a simple ceremony in San Francisco, with Sarah cooing happily in Mrs. Abernathy's arms and Mary serving as bridesmaid. The federal prosecutor, whose case against Calloway and other mining magnates was proceeding successfully thanks in part to Thomas's evidence, gave the bride away. Xavier had sold his ranch, using the proceeds to purchase a small property outside Sacramento close enough to civilization for Wilhelmina to eventually resume teaching when Sarah was older, but with enough land for Xavier to raise horses, which had always been his passion. Are you sure? Wilhelmina had asked when he first proposed the plan. Your home meant so much to you. Home isn't a place, Xavier had replied, gathering her and Sarah into his arms. It's the people you love, and I'd build a new house 100 times over to keep you both safe and happy. Standing beside him now as they exchanged vows, Wilhelmina reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From desperate flight to profound love, from complete isolation to the warm circle of friends surrounding them today. I do, she said clearly when the time came, her eyes never leaving Xavier's face. I do, he echoed, his voice deep and certain. As he leaned down to seal their vows with a kiss, Wilhelmina knew with absolute clarity that they had found in each other not just safety, but the rarest gift of all, a love born of courage and kindness, tested by fire and made stronger for it. You and that baby are safe here, Xavier had promised on that fateful day, and in his arms, in his heart, they always would be. 5 years later, their home outside Sacramento had flourished into a thriving horse ranch. The modest house Xavier had built with his own hands had expanded to accommodate their growing family. Sarah, now a lively 5-year-old with her mother's auburn hair and her adoptive father's blue eyes, had been joined by 3-year-old Thomas, named for the father he would never know but whose courage had made their family possible. Wilhelmina taught at the local school 3 days a week, her classroom often filled with flowers and interesting rocks that Sarah collected on her adventures around the ranch. Xavier's reputation for breeding and training quality horses had spread throughout the territory, bringing a comfortable prosperity to their lives. Frank Calloway had eventually been convicted of fraud and conspiracy, though the murder charges related to Thomas Parker's death had been more difficult to prove. Still, his 15-year sentence in a federal prison ensured that the shadow of his threats no longer darkened their lives. On this particular evening, as summer twilight lingered over the land, Wilhelmina stood on the porch watching Xavier teaching Sarah to ride her new pony, a small, dappled mare with a gentle disposition. Thomas sat on his father's shoulders, tiny hands clutching Xavier's hat for balance as he shouted encouragement to his sister. The sight filled Wilhelmina's heart with a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was the life she had never dared hope for during those desperate days of flight, not just safety, but abundance. Not just survival, but happiness. Xavier looked up, catching her eye across the yard. Even after 5 years of marriage, that simple connection still sent a flutter through her chest. He said something to Sarah, then lifted Thomas down and strode toward the house, his smile warm and private just for her. "Everything all right?" he asked, climbing the porch steps to stand beside her. Wilhelmina leaned into his embrace, fitting perfectly against his side as she always had. "Everything is perfect," she answered truthfully. He pressed a kiss to her temple, his arm tightening around her waist. "Sarah's a natural on that pony, fearless, just like her mother." Wilhelmina laughed softly. "I was terrified most of the time, if you recall." "Terrified, maybe," Xavier acknowledged, "but you kept going anyway. That's true courage." His hand moved to rest gently on her abdomen, where the first subtle roundness of their third child was just becoming visible. "And that's what we'll teach all our children." The simple gesture filled Wilhelmina with warmth. They hadn't told the children about the new baby yet, waiting until she was further along, but Xavier's quiet joy in the pregnancy was evident in 100 small ways. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Found it in town today." He handed her a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Curious, Wilhelmina unwrapped it to find a leather-bound journal, the cover tooled with a simple design of mountains and stars. "For your stories," Xavier explained. "The ones you tell the children at night. I thought maybe you might want to write them down someday." Touched by his thoughtfulness, Wilhelmina ran her fingers over the smooth leather. She had begun creating stories for Sarah as a way to preserve the memory of Thomas, weaving tales of brave geologists and the treasures hidden within the earth. Over time, these had expanded to include adventures featuring a tall, quiet cowboy with eyes the color of the summer sky. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's perfect." Xavier shrugged, still somewhat uncomfortable with gratitude even after all these years. "Just thought your stories deserved to be remembered," he said. "They're good ones. We've made a good story, haven't we?" Wilhelmina mused, watching Sarah trot her pony in careful circles while Thomas clapped his hands in delight. Despite everything, or maybe because of it, Xavier's arm tightened around her. "The best kind," he agreed. "The kind that starts with trouble but ends with home, home." The word encompassed so much: this land, this house, these children. But most of all, the man beside her who had risked everything for a desperate woman and her child, who had offered safety when she needed it most, and who had given his heart completely once the danger was past. "I love you, Xavier Thornton," Wilhelmina said, turning in his arms to face him. His smile, still rare but all the more precious for it, brightened his weathered face. "And I love you, Wilhelmina Thornton. More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." As the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Wilhelmina stood in the circle of her husband's arms, watching their children play in the yard of the home they had built together. The journey that had begun in fear and flight had led to this moment of perfect peace, this family forged through courage and kindness and unbreakable love. "You and that baby are safe here," Xavier had promised on that first desperate day. He had kept that promise, not just for a night or a season, but for a lifetime. And in that safety, they had found everything: